Hello. I'm Adrian. In this place of forgiveness and reconciliation, I hope the good people of Coventry can forgive me. I come from Birmingham. Go easy on me. I don't want to alarm you, but there are 3 Ken Loaches with us today, or at least 3 personae of the one and only Ken Loach. He is, of course, known first and foremost as a filmmaker, director of classic British movies, Kathy Come Home, Poor Cow and Kes, double Palme d'Or winner for The Wind That Shakes the Barley and I, Daniel Blake. He is incidentally one of only 9 filmmakers who have won that Cannes Award twice, and he is one of Angelina Jolie's favourite movie directors. Ken Loach is also known as a political activist, a man of the left. We may touch on that a little bit later on. But our main intention on the Made in the Midlands podcast is to find out more about Ken Loach, man of the Midlands. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Ken Loach. Ken, I'm very keen to find out about your upbringing a few miles down the road in Nuneaton, but I want to start in this place, in this beautiful cathedral, because this is a place that does have some meaning for you.
Yes, thanks Adrian, and it's always thrilling to be in this building, and with the old cathedral next door. No, you're right, Adrian, it's one of my earliest memories, when I must have been four, I think, in 1940. And this is my memory, maybe false, but this is my memory, that my mother and I were in the Anderson shelter in next door's garden. That's the one in the garden, with the corrugated iron. And I was collecting shrapnel. I had a shrapnel collection like any other. All the kids had shrapnel collections. And the neighbour came in and said, "They've destroyed the cathedral." And so it still gets me. It is extraordinary. And I remember that. I remember the word, them saying that. And the smell of the night air. And the horror that people had for that. And of course we knew there were many killed as well. So they were the harsh memories really. So to be here is very touching. So thanks for asking me.
It's a great pleasure, Ken. And I just wonder, in the years and months afterwards then, obviously you were 8 miles away, it was an age before most people had a car. Did you come and see the cathedral? Did you come and see the wreckage that the bombers had made?
I don't remember. So I was only 4 or 5 at the time. Yes, we certainly came at some point. I don't remember when. And we didn't visit Coventry very often because we didn't have a car. I seem to remember there was a 658 bus, an old Midland red bus that used to come. So it came from time to time. And obviously more as you get older, as a teenager.
Yeah. Does this place have any religious meaning for you? I know that you're patron of the British Humanist Association.
Well, it has a great resonance. I'm not religious, but I think the endeavours of people and the spiritual life that people have, and that has gone on down the centuries, and the history that the buildings contain, and is very moving and is very important and is central to who we are. And I think the sense of what gives us depth as human beings is not, you don't have to be religious to understand that. To understand what moves you, what touches you, the values you believe in and try to promote and be absorbed by are not dependent on a religion, though religious people may experience that as well. So the buildings have huge significance. I mean, the craftsmen, not only who built this, but who built the old cathedral, you know, the effort, the organisation, the men who died building it probably, that it's redolent with who we are.
In terms of identity, and true to the theme of the Made in the Midlands podcast, would you say that you're someone who has a Midlands identity?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I barely moved out of Nuneaton for 18, 19 years, till I went and did national service. And my dad worked at Alfred Herbert as an electrician for 46 years, and I think they gave him 46 quid when he left. Not noted for their generosity. He was an electrician, an electrical engineer, and what I think is a real Midlands characteristic is a real respect for craft. I mean, the cliche is we were the workshop of the world, but the respect for craft, the respect for skill, the enjoyment of the craft, but whatever it was, I think is very much a Midland characteristic. We don't take shortcuts traditionally at work. And the school I went to, in the grammar school in Nuneaton, had a wonderful history master, Sidney Reed Brett. And he carried that same rigour into his analysis of history. And he wasn't one of those teachers who was an inspirational figure who made you interested in history if you weren't. But if you were, his system of notation, you'd have causes, you'd have root causes, you'd have immediate causes. Beneath that, you'd have 1, 2, 3. Under that, you'd have A, B, C. And under that, you'd have Roman numerals, 1, 2, dotted, 3, 1 V for 4. And you had to analyse your thoughts, you had to analyse what you were studying. And that rigour, I think, is a Midland characteristic. You know, we go to the root. And he said, what is radical? He defined radicalism. He said, you know what a radish is? It's a vegetable you get from the root. And to really understand the world, you have to be radical, like the radish, same word, go to the root. And that image of what it is to be rigorous just stuck with me ever since. So it's a Midlands characteristic, get to the root.
And that clearly permeates your filmmaking, and you still maintain close connections with your hometown of Nuneaton. Just so we're clear about this, you're not just somebody who's swanned in today to Coventry, but you're a regular visitor still and have connections in Nuneaton.
Well, I've got family nearby, and I think one of my family's here. I hope Molly's here, in the audience, and I'm connected to friends there, and connected to an organisation called Doorway, which is a brilliant charity there. So I pop back now and then. I keep meaning to come back and see the borough, but I haven't made it for a few years.
Yeah, it's a self-proclaimed football tart, ladies and gentlemen. We'll talk more about that maybe a little bit later. But born on the 17th of June, 1936, then what can you remember about your early life in Nuneaton?
I remember we lived in Manor Court Road, which was on the same street as the football club. Sadly, it's not there anymore. We're a few hundred yards from the borough. So I used to go there with my dad when I was must have been 5, 6 years old. My dad worked away during the war, but I used to go there when I was very young. Looking back, my memories of Nuneaton are that its diversity. It was a proper town. I mean, there were every kind of shop you wanted. And when I go back now, it's hollowed out. You know, and that richness of a community that is self-sufficient has gone. But now I remember that. I remember having my mum used sometimes to go to J.C. Smith's for a cup of tea and a cake, and the waitresses, you know, were black and white, proper waitresses gear. I mean, it was a town, a working class town, but a town with dignity, and a town with kind of a sense of its own identity. I'm proud of it. A mayor called it the Queen of the Midlands. I'm not quite sure in what sense that was meant, but there you go. It was.
But you were talking to me, I think, when we were preparing for this interview about the range of shops, the diversity of shops. You said to me there was almost no middle class in Nuneaton, but nevertheless it had trades and skills that people now would associate with the middle class. Just explain that a little bit more.
Well, I remember I think it was the department store that had a bacon counter with a man who would cut you, slice you the bacon. It was Parsons and Sherwin's, the hardware shop, the chemist, Ilif's, I think it was Ilif's, the chemist, Leeks, I think they're still Leeks, the jewelers. But they were people you knew who would give you advice and who would guide you through what you wanted to buy if you didn't know. And it was a very identifiable community. But I don't remember now a middle class presence. But maybe that was just the circles we moved in.
And when you say the town now has been hollowed out, what do you mean by that?
Most of the big shops have closed. I think this is not just the pandemic. I think this is a pattern of a pattern of development that was in train before the pandemic hit. So that the major shops had closed. Even some of the chain stores were closing as more and more shopping went online. But that sense of being online shopping isolates people. And that sense of community, the town centre being somewhere where you met friends, and like the library, where we always used to hang out as kids, that seems to have gone. But now, given the pandemic, yes, I think the main shops have gone. And with it a lack of, I was talking to someone this morning who lives there, and with it a sense of loss and a sense of lack of ambition and being neglected. And it would be nice if some of the what's being spent on the City of Culture, if a bit was siphoned off to Nuneaton, I think it would be appreciated, really. Would be appreciated.
And talking about that sense of community and identity, I think I'm suggesting that came very readily to you because you were of mining stock, your family going back were miners in Midlands, just up the road?
Yes, my grandfather was a miner. Most of his sons were miners. It was a family of 10 in Newtown Road, Bedford, and the last surviving sibling died just a few years ago at over 100, Louis, in Bedford, and I saw her just before she died. But my dad did an apprenticeship in the pit and then got into a factory. But ironically, didn't see much daylight because the factory was 20 times the size of this cathedral, I think, and there was not much regard given for daylight.
And would it be fair to say, especially in light of your work, that part of that identity, that Midlands identity, the mining identity, was a working class identity?
And it was. My mother's family, where my grandfather on my mother's side was a tailor, and he had a shop in just next to the old police station in Nuneaton, opposite the town hall, with the Corinthian pillars. And then he moved to Queen's Road, opposite a fantastic old pub, which of course is no longer there, the King's Head, which I think was 17th century, very old, lovely pub, which of course had to be knocked down. So in a way, they were petty bourgeois, I guess, to be precise. So in a way, there was they weren't, I have to be very acute about this because somebody will pick me up if I'm not careful. But they weren't strictly a working class side of the family, and I didn't have an Eton voice because they were from Gloucestershire, and my mother's family were from Cheltenham. So we went from Manicourt Road to Lutterworth Road, which was seen as a step up. So it was these gradations of class are very obsessive, aren't they?
Did you have an inside loo?
We did have an inside loo, but Nye Bevan insisted the working class had an inside loo. Not only one, he said, and I learned this when we did a film about it. He said, no, you need an inside loo attached to the house downstairs, because when the kids come in from the garden, they need somewhere to go and not traipse through the house. So Nye Bevan in the council houses, he said, nothing is too good for the working class, and two loos.
I've seen your dad described as a working class Tory, but I just want to check this story with you. I heard it said that he turned down a promotion because it would have meant receiving monthly paychecks rather than cash at the end of the week. Is that true?
Well, he was reluctant, yes. He liked his pay in the brown envelope every week. So he didn't want to go on the staff, as they called it. But towards the end of his life he did, and he became in charge of the maintenance. But he was the perfect employee because he was absolutely loyal. He worked 7 days a week. 7 days a week for maintenance, because if you had to work not only when the factory was going, but when it was shut. Because there was some maintenance you could only do when the factory was closed. So he went in 7 days a week, every morning at 6:30. Like the bus would come pick him up every day, Saturday morning and Sunday morning. And then he got ill with cancer just before he was due to retire, and then he died 2 or 3 years later, and his pension stopped with him. So from the employer's point of view, he was the perfect employee, tragically for him.
Your dad was a Daily Express reader. How conscious were you growing up of politics?
I was conscious. Yes, I was conscious. I remember the Crusader and looking back, the straight imperialist propaganda from Beaverbrook.
The Crusader, for people who don't know, was the character on the masthead of the Daily Express.
Exactly. Yes. With a sort of Crusader shield with the St. George's thing on the cross on the shield and the sword. Yes, straight imperialism. And that came in, and I have to confess, cathedrals are where you confess, aren't they? I have to confess, just after the war, we had a mock election, and I did stand as a Tory.
Ken Loach is a Tory. You heard me here first.
It didn't last long. Mea culpa, but in expiation, it didn't last long. But I did hear Nye Bevan speak. He came to Nuneaton in the Co-op Hall, which was one of the few decent buildings in the town, and where they used to have tea dances. And my mother and father met at a tea dance in the Co-op Hall, and that's gone now. It's where we did school plays, for anybody who knows Nuneaton.
And talking of your school then, I know you went to grammar school as a secondary school. Tell me a little bit about your junior school. What place was that?
The junior school, there was, this again is interesting. It comes from my mother's family, who wanted their grandchildren to go to the girls' Sky School, had a preparatory school. So I was taken there, and it was a strange experience. Because when I went to grammar school, of course I met kids who hadn't been there, and I realised what I'd missed actually.
So you'd been to a prep school, to a private prep school?
Yes, whether it was private or not, I don't know, but I think it may well have been. But it it was strange. It wasn't a broad experience. I mean, the teachers were substantial ladies, but I'd missed a lot. I'd missed a lot, and the kids who came, which was everyone else, when I joined the grammar school, had a much richer experience, and it was quick to adapt, but there was a sense of fun, you know, that you'd missed.
And you were then a scholarship kid then? You got into King Edward VI, the grammar school?
Well, it was free.
Oh, okay. But you had to pass 11 plus, yeah?
Yes, it was 11 plus, yeah. In 1947 that was. Yeah. And that was, it was, I mean, the great injustice of that was that in a town of, what was the population, 60, 70,000 people, I suppose, there were only 60 boys each year went to that. And 60 girls went to the girls' high school, which again was a free school. It was a state school. But it was such a tiny minority. And then that was it. At age 16, you were going to leave. You didn't have a pathway to higher education. So it was 120 kids out of a big population. It was so unjust.
For you, what kind of school was it though? Was it a good education?
Yes, and most of the masters had been in the war. And they had, I mean, some of them had a kind of approximate approach to education, you know, and the characters were very extraordinary. I mean, I've talked about the history teacher who was, I mean, I owe a lot to him, a lot. But we had, there was a physics teacher, Mr. Herbert, who enjoyed cricket. I mean, he was a fast bowler. He would really like to have been a fast bowler. There was Mr. Branson, who again loved all foot sports. And he was not only the English teacher, but if somebody asked him a question involving rugby football, which wasn't my interest at all, he would talk for 40 minutes. So, you know, there was Mr. Pearson, the geography teacher, who we used to destroy the poor man, destroy him. And he was a lovely man, really. He was a bit like Private Godfrey. You know, anybody know Dad's Army? But imagine Private Godfrey trying to teach 30 unruly kids. Sad, but yeah, they were a good bunch, really, a good bunch.
And is it true that's really where you got your love of the theatre?
Yeah, we did school plays, and I used to get into them if I could.
I've got a note that you played a nymph in a school production of The Tempest.
I was aged 11. Yes. There's a photograph of a bunch of nymphs and shepherds, not shepherds, but a bunch of nymphs. And I still get a letter from the guy who played, I think he was Prospero. So yes, the old memories linger on. But it was taken very seriously. And I think, I mean, the idea of, you know, kids, boys playing Shakespeare seems a bit ridiculous. And I know now the emphasis on write something yourself, describe your own experience. But I think that's good. But I think you miss something by not learning the lines, because they stick with you forever. And you may not always understand them exactly. It's like learning poetry. You may not understand them exactly at the time, but my goodness, they stick with you. And they become part of your hinterland. And so the bits of poetry that we had to learn, don't ask me now, asked it to fortune, but they do, or just odd lines stick with you, and I think they're enriching. So I think learning the great classics, whether it's Shakespeare or whatever, and learning has a value, and I think it's sad if we don't do that.
And you were hooked, weren't you? You used to cycle from Nuneaton to the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon to go and watch plays. That's how smitten you were with the theatre.
Yes, well, there was there were two or three of us who used to pedal from Nuneaton through Coventry to Kenworth through that long road, you know, you see that when you're at the top of it, it looks like the biggest valley in the world, but when you're at the bottom, it's quite shallow. Gibbet Hill, and cycle there, cycle through Warwick to Stratford. And yeah, I went through all the great names of the time. Gilbert, Olivier, Peggy Ashcroft, and the regulars there, Harry Andrews and Michael Redgrave. Great performances. And there was one, I went to see Titus Andronicus once on my own, which was a very bloodthirsty play. I mean, I guess people will remember. And there's at one point, Vivian Lee was in it with Laurence Olivier, and at one point her tongue is cut out, ripped out. And they did it beautifully with obviously no fake blood, but just red, thin streamers falling from her mouth. And it was horrific. And I must have been, what, 16, 17, something like that. And I'd cycled all the way there. And it was been a hot day. And I'd only got standing room, so I was standing at the back of the stalls. And when she came on, and her tongue had been ripped out, and you could see the blood trailing, and there was some really, I think some piercing music, high notes, and I fell over. And the people selling programs had to come round and pick me up and carry me out. Head between the knees in the foyer. And then I got back for the last act. And, no, it was, but they were extraordinary memories. And I think everyone knows the memories you have when you're young are the ones you refer back to all your life, you know. And so those memories of those plays and those performances, I just stay with you. And I think the effort to get there made them memorable in a way.
So that's an incredible memory from 70 years ago. Yeah. What do you think it was about the theatre then, of all things, as well as football, that really attracted you?
I think it was the evocation of, well, it was extraordinary stories. It's the depth of emotional commitment. It's the fact that you are, I mean, I wish football could always do this. Well, football does do it, and theatre and films don't do it very often. You don't know what's going to happen next. You know, you don't know. And the excitement of that, and the depth of the experience, and the depth of the emotion, and the desperate feeling of pity, and or the laughter that you share, or the anger that you feel about what you see, and the beauty of the language. You know, just the beauty of the language. From a Warwickshire lad. Let's not forget, you know, you talk about the Midlands character, could you have it better, really? He's our Midlands character, isn't he? And it's not only precise, it's celebratory, it's understanding, it's enraging, it's compassionate, it's delicate, it's romantic, you know. My goodness, if that's the Midlands character, I'll settle for that.
Well, you've sold me, I mean. Talking of the beauty of the language, let's talk about football now then, Ken. Because you were raised on the team that were then known as Nuneaton Borough.
Still are.
Nuneaton Town?
No, they've gone back.
Have they gone back to being Borough? Excellent.
Yeah. Up the borough is the cry.
But the ground has moved, but you lived on the road where the old stadium was. Just tell me about those memories. Evoke some of that nostalgia,
the memories.
if you would.
Well, yes, it was. Again, I went with my dad, and we sat in the stand because I was so small. I wouldn't have seen the game if we'd been standing on the roadside end, which was where a lot of the fans stood behind the goal, and the cut ran on the other side of the I have to call it the cut, it wasn't the canal cut, on the other side of the little grandstand. But to me, it was a big grandstand, and I remember everyone had a lot of the old blokes had a pipe, so it was the pipe smoke that used to evoke being at Nuneaton Borough. And no, we had some great, what we thought were great players. A forward called Paul, I forget his first name, and a brilliant football centre forward called Ken Plant, who I met later on in life, actually, when not so long ago, it must be maybe 12, 15 years ago, I suppose. Winger called Lapworth, a football called Scattergood, and a fullback. And we had a German goalkeeper as a prisoner of war during the war. And he was a goalkeeper. And he played for the reserves, and I think he went on to play in the first team. And I was trying to remember his name, and it's just escaped me. And when he was playing in the reserves, I had an autograph book, and I walked around the ground behind the goal. And when they were up the other end, he gave me his autograph. He gave me his autograph, and I was as pleased as punch by that.
Nuneaton's very un-Bertrand.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And in those days, non-league football was pretty well attended. Nuneaton, I think, played in those days in the Birmingham combination.
Birmingham combination. Yeah, we played all the Black Country clubs, you know, Darlaston and Starbridge and Dudley Town. Dudley, you played Dudley.
But you might get a couple of thousand of people attending
absolutely.
a match.
Yeah. It was passionate. Absolutely. Yeah.
People might know you these days as a supporter of Bath City.
Yes.
How do you explain that?
Well, I think it's important to support your local team. I mean, when we lived in London for a long time, I followed football. But I still watch the Borough score every week. But no, support the local team, really, because you want to go to the game. I mean, there's no point in following football if you don't go to the games. No, we've become a community-owned club, and yeah, it was on the par with the Borough, really, and so I felt at home.
Yeah, we were just having a chat before we came on, actually, about the state of modern football. You're a big supporter of the idea of fan-owned football rather than football being run by absentee landlords, foreign billionaires and so on.
Yes. Well, I mean, football is about identity, isn't it? It's about supporting your community. Your community is represented there on the pitch, and of course it should be owned by the fans, and it's down to them whether it's successful or not. You know? Absolutely. I mean, it's a demonstration of who we are, and why should it be owned by someone else? I mean, the lower league clubs, by and large, are owned by either local businessmen or you know, people who've got an interest in the club. I should say, people have the wrong idea about Bath. It's people know it as a blue rinse tourist place, but actually, it's got its ordinary people as well.
You're obviously smitten by the theatre. You're a bright lad doing well, and we'll talk about Oxford in a while. But your first job, I think, was in this city, in Coventry.
Yes, amazingly. When I think I must have been on holiday, and when the Belgrade Theatre opened, because we used to go to the Hippodrome and see the variety acts. We saw all the old variety acts in the Hippodrome, and then the Belgrade opened, or it was about to open, and I got a job backstage at the Belgrade. The director was a man called Brian Bailey, who sadly was killed on the M1 shortly after it had opened. Very tragic, because he was a very progressive director, I think. And anyway, I got a job, and the opening, there were people here who will remember it, I'm sure. The opening production was a musical of the importance of being an artist, and dressing one of the main actors, singers in that. In fact, a bloke called Brian Johnson, who was a singer, was me. Ironing his trousers, helping him into his frock coat, and enjoying all the backstage gossip that was going on. And there was quite a bit. There were close relations with the visiting thespians at the Hippodrome, and I had to be very discreet. But no, it was an insight into the professional theatre that you don't get if you're just in the audience.
After school, you did national service in the RAF, you went to Oxford. At what point did you become politically aware?
Not at university, not at university. I mean, I was a misspent youth, putting on plays really, which was extraordinary and I mean, a great education in itself. But I was meant to study law, but I didn't study a great deal of law, sadly, much to my father's despair, because for a factory electrician in Nuneaton to have a son, you know, get into a university, and that one was. Looking back, he was very touched by that, and he was massively disappointed that I didn't become a lawyer, which I'm sure any parent now will understand. But the politics came later, after I joined the BBC and was working on a series called The Wednesday Play. And we did, I mean, I was lucky to get the job, very lucky. We were doing contemporary fiction, and the writers we worked with and the people who were engaged were looking at the world and trying to understand it. And this is where my memory of S. Reed Brett, the history teacher at the grammar school, came in. Because once you start to look at how society works, you have to ask the questions. And when you ask the questions, then the answers become all too apparent. And there's a stage-by-stage development to say, hey, things aren't right here. And I guess that's what led to politics.
You must have reflected on your own sort of gilded progress to that stage then, really, hadn't you? The prep school, passing the 11 plus, getting to Oxford. How did you look back then on your own path to the BBC?
Extraordinary fortune. Extraordinary fortune. I was just lucky, really. I was just lucky. And I think I'd say to be one of 60 boys in that town, to have the luck to be able to stay on. I mean, my dad, when he won a scholarship, you talk about scholarships, he won a scholarship to the grammar school when he was 11, and his mother said, I'm sorry you can't go, we can't afford the uniform. And that would have been 1916 in Bedworth. And he carried that, he carried that disappointment all his life. So that's why he was chuffed when I got in.
And I guess that explains then why he was so keen for you to do well in the professional sphere, to go on and be a lawyer and have that kind of steady middle class profession.
Yeah. Well, every night, I mean, he read books every night he came out to the factory. And he read all the law books, he read, well, the memoirs, he knew all the great barristers of the Edwardian era, you know, Carson and Burkiss, one was another one, and anyway, he knew them all and their cases. And when I did law, that was his dream, and I'm afraid I shattered his dream.
Third class degree at Oxford.
He said, you'll never have 2 pennies to rub together.
Did he ever become reconciled with the career path that you chose?
Yes. It was, when I got to the BBC was class in those days. The BBC was respectable. And when he lived long enough to see them go out nationally. You know, you mentioned Cathy Come Home, which got some notoriety, it was a national event, really, as it turned out. So no, he was pleased with that, begrudgingly. He wouldn't say too much, Another Midlands characteristic, he never said, well done, you know. He said, well, not too bad. Not too bad was the height. If you got not too bad, you know, wow, that was brilliant.
But that supposedly misspent youth in Oxford was the reason that you ended up at the BBC, wasn't it? And you really steeped yourself in theatre by that time. You played opposite Dudley Moore at Leicester Guildhall in 1959 in Bartholomew Fair by Ben Jonson. You were really, never mind the law, you were really into being an actor.
Yes, well, yes, when I left university, I was supposed to be, well, I tried to be an actor and direct as well. And I was the worst actor in England, I have to say at the time. And spent most of my time as a supply teacher and put on school plays with the kids. But the claim to fame was to be an understudy in a review in the West End with Kenneth Williams and Sheila Hancock in 1961, and that was comedy in a big way. So I didn't understudy Kenneth Williams. I understudied the second lead, a guy called Lance Percival. But mercifully, I never had to go on. Otherwise, the theatre-going public of London would have been very disappointed, I think.
But presumably, this was the experience. This was the CV that got you through the door of the BBC.
Yes. That and a stint in Cannons Hill Park with the Arena Theatre Company, which played open air. We played in a tent in Cannon Hill Park for the schools in the morning and an adult audience in the evening. And I gave them my Brer Fox, which doesn't rate highly in the theatrical lexicon.
I'm sure they still talk about it today, Ken Loach's Brer Fox. You talk about that political consciousness coming then through the Wednesday play on the BBC, but in amongst that there was kind of work-a-day directorial stuff, wasn't there? Live episodes of Zcast, for example.
Yes. I mean, television then was a live exercise, and it was terrifying because there'd be 12 million people viewing it live as it went out, and people will know that in television there's something called a vision mix, and they cut from camera to camera while it's being shot. And the great art was not to get another camera in shot because they'd be pulling them out of the way as you cut to a camera. But I worked with a vision mixer who knitted when this was going on. So I was terrified. I couldn't find my place in the script. She was knitting as well as cutting the cameras. So it was a nightmare experience. And the success was not to get a camera in shot. If you didn't get a camera in shot, everybody applauded.
Never mind the quality of the drama, just don't get a camera in
shot.
shot.
But I learned a huge amount in doing it. A huge amount in terms of directing. What not to do. Shall I say? I mean, the classic thing with directing, television, theatre, anything, films really, what normally happens is the cast get together at the beginning and they have a read-through. Nobody reads it. And then you rehearse it. And then you put it on. And in television, you would run it like a theatre production. People would be shot in that time it takes to do it. Or in films, you do it, shot by shot, day by day, but you still have that read-through. And what I found doing Zcast was that the regulars were good, and I would have to cast all the other parts, and we would read it through. And at the read-through, everybody was brilliant. They were really good. I would direct them for 10 days, and then we did it, and they were dreadful. They were dreadful, and I thought I'm doing something wrong here. And actually, the lesson for me was, what you have to do on film is to create something as though it is happening for the first time. There's a sense of immediacy, a sense of spontaneity, of almost improvisation. Although the lines are written, they have to be absorbed and spontaneous. So what we do now, we don't rehearse, we don't read it, we shoot it in sequence, and the actors don't know what's going to happen next in the story. So, and that, you get a sense of energy from that, and a sense of an energy and a sense of what's the journey we're on, what's the danger, what's the next bend in the road, what are we going to discover? And it makes shooting exciting rather than predictable. And then it was a lesson from doing Z-cars and realizing that how you can ruin good performances.
That's really interesting. Talking about Kathy Come Home, that really set in train a very successful period in your career. I just want to reflect a little bit on the 1980s when you had several films censored. You had a play at the World Court that was scrapped 36 hours before it was due to be performed. You went through a pretty torrid time.
Yes,
and yet you've come the other side of that. You know, you've shown incredible resilience. But how was that period when, well, you couldn't get arrested, so to speak?
Couldn't direct traffic, you're right. Well, I think, this was, the 70s we'd done BBC series, and we were running towards the end of that. Tony Garner, the producer, I worked with, another Midlands lad from Birmingham, we're almost the same age. And he went to the States to do films, try and do films there. The BBC weren't interested. I started documentaries at Central TV. But it was 79, Margaret Thatcher was elected. Another Midlander. We're not all good. Margaret Thatcher was elected and waged war, really. She waged war on ordinary people. And unemployment went through the roof, up to well over 3 million. Factories were closed. There were laws against trade unions. Strikes were provoked. And it was a period of chaos and poverty and real confrontation. And the broadcasters typically, as always, adopted the prevailing mood of the politicians. In fact, Channel 4 even advertised for right-wing producers. The advert exists. They wanted producers with a right because, they're all seen as too lefty. So they wanted right-wing producers, and the broadcasters became more right-wing. So, for people who were of a different point of view, it was very hard to get work. One area was the documentary department at Central TV. People like John Pilger was working there, and other good directors, and I got taken on. But I did a documentary about the steel strike. They would not broadcast it. It was after it was over, they would not broadcast it until finally it went out midday on a Sunday. I did out of it, Channel 4 said, we will do, a producer of Channel 4, brave man, said, we will do 4 films on the same subject. And the subject was, and this is why it wasn't broadcast, the subject was that the myth was that unions were so strong, they were holding the country to ransom. Remember the phrase? The reality was that the leaders of the unions were doing deals that accepted factory closures, that accepted redundancies, and their deal was about the redundancy deal. It wasn't about maintaining the jobs. It wasn't about maintaining the communities. It was allowing the closures, allowing unemployment to rise, but just getting a few bob at the end of it, which of course everybody knows soon disappeared. There was a whole layer of militant, angry, working class people saying this is not good enough. We want unions to defend the jobs. We want unions to keep the factories open because they're viable. The struggle was between that layer of militancy and the union leaders who were doing the deals. And that was the struggle. And we did 4 films called Questions of Leadership. This is before the miners' strike. Four films. They were programmed on Channel 4. Channel 4. There was the 2 people we'd interviewed. One was Frank Chappell, if anybody remembers him, Lord Chappell, Labour right-winger, became a founder member of the SDP, went to the House of Lords, and Terry Duffy, who was AEU, again a Labour right-winger. They complained to Channel 4 before it went out. Channel 4 was run by, the main man was Edmund Dell, another member of the SDP when it was founded, another ex-Labour right-winger, been in the cabinet. And Central had Robert Maxwell on the board, and his deputy was Sam Silkin, another Labour right-winger, been Solicitor General, I think, under Howard Wilson. They all agreed, we don't want these programs. They were rank and file. A lot of people from Labour, from Leyland, where Dave Robinson was the...
Yeah, from the British Leyland.
Yeah, but no,
the Austin.
Longbridge.
Yeah,
some are from Longbridge, some are from car workers from Coventry. Good, terrific car worker from the Wolseley, in fact, I think it was. Car worker from Oxford, from Cowley. And all the other industries, dock workers, miners, and so on. And they'd never been on television before, most of them. Rank and file people. Channel 4 said, your voices will not be heard. You will not be heard. And they stopped the programs. And that was a year's work, and it was a year to fight it. Because they dragged it out for a year. And then, of course, there was the miners' strike. And then we did a film for the miners' strike. And I tried everywhere to get a film commission, just a documentary. If the gardening, I don't want about their allotments, if the gardening program would take it, and they wouldn't. No chance of Panorama or the World in Action, they wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. The only story they would tell, the only story was picket line violence. Now, anyone who was there on that, during those pickets, saw the police vans going through and the coppers holding up £5 notes, taunting the guys who were on strike, whose families were starving. But I saw that. So let me just finish the story. It was done, Melvin Bragg, old pal, I said, do one, there was an outbreak of creative writing. There were extraordinary concerts done for the miners, writing groups, particularly the women, the miners' wives. And I said, look, this is an outburst of creativity here. In this extraordinary period, let's do a film about that. He said, right. He did the South Bank show. We did the documentary of the South Bank show. What they were writing about was the police walloping on their heads. A lot of poems about that. So we included them. And from students, we got a lot of footage of people being hit with truncheons. They didn't show it on the BBC or ITV, but we got it from other sources. Put it together, showed it to Melvin Bragg and the hierarchy at London Weekend Television. They looked at it and they said, we can't broadcast that. We can't broadcast that. This isn't art, this is politics. I said, if this was in Chile, if this was in Poland, you'd have it on next week. Because it's happening on your doorstep, you won't show it. And they didn't show it. They didn't show it. And finally went out on Channel 4 just before the strike ended, when it would have no effect. And the price was to get a right-wing trade unionist to attack Arthur Scargill the next week. And that was their balance. And again, people who had never been heard stopped from broadcasting. So when you talk about objectivity, and the BBC talks about it all the time, and impartiality, just remember, There's no impartiality.
One final question.
Sorry.
No,
Too long.
that's absolutely fine. Just to explain, we will finish the podcast with we will finish the podcast recording very shortly, but we will give you a chance to ask Ken a few questions as well. That'll be a slightly separate process, but there won't be any delay on that. You talk about the confluence of art and politics. That's really what you do, Ken. And in recent years, you've found success with I, Daniel Blake, Sorrow We Miss You, and so on. Do you feel optimistic then at 85 that the values you stand for, both as a filmmaker and as an activist, are now being listened to perhaps more than they were in the past?
I think they exist. I think they exist and they're very present. But I think the balance of power politically, and we've seen it very much in the last few years, the balance of power at the moment has swung very much against us. Because you see what's going on in the Labour Party now. Destruction of it as it stands, as it was. It was the largest party in Europe. Nearly 600,000 members. 120,000 of them now left in the last year because of what's happening. So the public discourse has moved against the values that we've, I'm just one of a gang, but what we've tried to do in a halting fashion is moved against us. But there's a sense among people that there is no peace without justice. And it's very interesting that this is a church built on reconciliation. But with no justice, there is no peace. And that's a lesson we've got to learn. And wherever it is, whether it's for the Palestinians, whether it's for the Rohingya, whether it's in China, wherever it is, until there is justice, there will be no peace. And there will be no peace here, in our country either, while people are treated with such contempt at work, when people live in poverty, when the food banks are rising, and we know the desperate conflict at the heart of our society. So until there is some social justice, we cannot live in equilibrium.
To round off the podcast, Ken, I did warn you we would ask you for a favourite Midlands memory. What have you got for me?
Oh, favourite Midlands memory. Oh dear, I thought of one now, I've forgotten. Oh dear. Well, I mean, going to Stratford is great, but we talked about that. A Midlands memory. I think it's cycling. It's cycling around the lanes of Warwickshire, and Leicestershire too. But Warwickshire in particular. I mean, there used to be 2 or 3 of us, and it was our courting that when we were 14 and 15. The aim was to find 2 or 3 girls who'd come cycling with us. We always ended up going up big hills and being out of breath at the top. So any idea of romance went down the window. But no, it was cycling around, and I used to, well, not that on those occasions, but I used to like old churches. So I'd had an old box camera. I used to take bad photographs of churches and put them in an album. And that sense of the Warwickshire landscape, the countryside, is when I think of the Midlands, that's one of the strongest images that come to mind.
I suspect you probably don't do heroes, but can you offer us a Midlands hero?
Absolutely, and it's a choice, because I used to come to go to Edgbaston and watch the cricket. So it's either Tom Dollery or Eric Hollis. It's got to be. Tom Dollery, fantastic, number 4, first captain of Warwickshire, first professional captain. Wonderful, wonderful player, got his autograph. But Eric Hollis, the fielder at mid-on, because he'd always drop and even then the ball used to get past from the Black Country. Great leg spinner. Nobody could spot his googly. And of course, famously, Bradman didn't in his last test, and out Eric got him. So, Tom Dolly and Eric Hollis, no question.
Lovely stuff. And a Midlands masterpiece. This could be a place or a thing.
A Midlands masterpiece. That's very difficult. I mean, my first thoughts are these two churches, really, because I think this is. I find this, as I said earlier, I find this place really moving. But the oldest cathedral is extraordinary. So I didn't get beyond these two churches together. But they do speak of hope. They do speak of hope. And tragedy and out of it hope. And I think we've got to hang on to that.
And finally, briefly, your Midlands manifesto.
Manifesto. Well, briefly, it's. I mean, one of the sadnesses of the Midlands character is that we're not noted. I mean, yes, there were radical elements in the 19th century and across the country, and in Birmingham certainly. But you know, when you think of political radicalism, you think of Liverpool or the South Yorkshire or Manchester or the North East or South Wales. But the manifesto would be to really look with harsh reality at the destruction of our towns and our cities. And I know there's a huge effort being made in Coventry. Good luck to it, and I hope it goes as a big triumph. But just look realistically at places like Nuneaton. And I have to say, George Eliot, remember, was in Nuneaton, writes another Coventry one, but I'll let that go. Along with Larry Grayson, of course, other great hero. But to look realistically at our landscape, say the only way we can rectify this is collective action. We take ownership of it. We use our common wealth to build communities that serve our needs, not the needs of multinational companies. In terms of the centres of our cities, the small businesses that can thrive, the landscape of the countryside, which links to climate change, of course. So we're right at the heart, literally and metaphorically, of the struggle to survive for mankind. And to look at that, we have to use our collective strength, not be a cork on the waves of the free market, but collectively to take power and say, this is how we're going to have a future. Because if we don't, if we let ourselves just be a cork on the moving tide, I worry for us. If we take collective power, then yes, we can solve things.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We have still got time for a few questions. That sort of ends the podcast element of the afternoon. But if there's anybody there who'd like to put their hand up, there's a gentleman at the back there I can see. We haven't got too much time, but we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. So if you can be as concise as you can be, please.
What a comment.
Thank you.
Or a comment. Yeah, comment and a question. Yeah.
You said earlier that the broadcast media always adopts a position that's sympathetic to the government of the day. And at the moment we've got a right-wing populist government. And yet the BBC are often accused of being too, to use the modern parlance, too woke or too sympathetic to left-wing causes. So do you think what you said is as true now as it's ever been?
I should have meant what I meant was, perhaps I didn't put it very clearly. The BBC represents the broad interest of the establishment. That may not be the government of the day. The government of the day may be seen as too right-wing, too populist. I think the BBC represents the sort of broad consensus of the establishment. It's a Ken Clark position. I mean, there was a word for it back in the Butskillism, when Rab Butler, the left-wing Tory, and Hugh Gaitskell, the right-wing Labour leader, had a centrist, what was a genuinely centrist position. And now, that's what they embody. So, you know, Gordon Brown, son of the manse, is a regular visitor now on the current affairs programmes, as is Blair. Never mind the million people that died in the Iraq War and the chaos that ensued. And for Gordon Brown, never mind the privatisation of all the public services that he encouraged and the disasters and the gig economy that followed. Never mind that. He's a right-wing Labour guy. We'll go with him. So that's what they embody. And I think that, and you only had to listen to Laura Kunsberg interviewing Starmer a few days ago. 3 times she asked him, when are you going to kick out Jeremy Corbyn? 3 times. And that's the position they have. And it's not necessarily the government, it's not necessarily Boris Johnson's government, it's the broad consensus of the ruling class and the establishment.
The gentleman here.
Fellow Keg's boy, and I was taught by Mr. Herbert as well. So, why did you never make a film based around Midlands or around Nuneaton? Because I thought, and I've saved that question for years, and I wanted to ask you why you never based a film around. I know you love Nuneaton and Midlands. You never made a film about the area, did you?
It's a really good point. I've wrestled with this for a long time. I'd love to have done it. We did one. A little documentary set in Darlaston, which is just the other side of it. It's in the Black Country, obviously, and that was a little documentary about five or six kids. It's very difficult. The writers I've worked with have been Barry Hines from South Yorkshire, Jim Allen from Manchester, Liverpool, Paul Laverty from Glasgow. I've tried once or twice. We began the research for I, Daniel Blake, which is about a man who isn't given the benefits he should have and dies as a result. And we began the research for that in Nuneaton with a brilliant woman called Carol Gallagher, who is the main organiser for this charity Doorway, which helps young people to get homes. And I couldn't find the writers, and that's my mistake. You know, the writers will exist, but I just didn't link up with one. My mistake. The identity is not as crisp as, say, if you're in Newcastle. It's a very clear regional identity. The Midlands are more amorphous, you know. I mean, it's the Gary Lineker accent, isn't it? You know, bleeding into, you know, Nuneaton, Birmingham, Black Country, and it isn't quite as tightly defined as, say, the Scouser or Barnsley. And there's something that's, you know, when a characteristic is very precise, it's very appealing, it's very easily defined. But the stories are here. It's a loss. It should have happened.
So there's a lady there. Thank you. There's a lady there in the blue or turquoise.
Oh, hi. I have lived and worked in Nuneaton for a long time, and I know you're one of its favourite sons. I was wondering what you could do to help make Nuneaton a better place. Obviously, with COVID, it's only gone downhill. Cinema and the cinema has been a major thing in Nuneaton, from what I've heard in the past. Is there anything you can do to help?
Well, I tried with a very good friend called Peter Lee, who runs the local history group in Nuneaton, and he and others tried to save the Ritz and get it restored as a cinema and as an art centre. I mean, the Ritz, for those who don't know, was an Art Deco building, classic old cinema. Very good cinema. It was the best cinema in Nuneaton. And it's still empty. You know, we failed. But you know, what has happened, I don't have time just to say it quickly, but the vandalism in Nuneaton is terrible. I mean, just then, this is about this diocese. This diocese. There's a wonderful late medieval church in Nuneaton, St Nicholas Church, everyone in, it's the parish church of Nuneaton. It had a historic graveyard around the churchyard. Beautiful old churchyard. The grammar school was at the other end of the churchyard. And we used to walk through the churchyard every Wednesday morning to go to the church once a week. It was one of the best, one of the few places remaining that had a sense of mystery, a sense of the past. It was evocative. Guess what? The diocese chose to tarmac a third of it for a car park. Tarmac the historic churchyard in Nuneaton for a car park. Could you make it up? I don't know which bishop that was, but I think he's got a few questions to answer.
There's a lady over here who's, yeah, there she is, sir.
Yeah, I just wondered if you would consider looking at the prospect of making a film or documentary on the ongoing privatisation by state of our National Health Service.
Yeah, well, you have made a very good documentary about the NHS, haven't you, Felix?
Well, it was part of the... We did a film called Spirit of 45, which was about the whole spirit of... They developed the welfare state after the war, but I mean, I think this is more precise. And that is... it must be done. I mean, it should be done. It's difficult, really. I mean, obviously, keep our NHS public and all the campaigns do a brilliant job. That film needs to be made, whether there comes a point when you reach a certain age where you can't do everything. I wish, and there have some good documentaries been made. The problem is the broadcasters won't show it. They won't show them for reasons we've explained. But it certainly needs one. And the other lady who spoke about Nuneaton, I'll always try and do what I can, and stay in touch with people. But they're big questions, really, and they're beyond one, a few individuals to help. But certainly, do what we can, always.
Time for a couple more questions. Was there a lady here? Yes, please. Towards the front, please.
I wanted to ask you specifically about Cathy Come Home, because I remember being completely shocked and affected by that. It had quite an influence at the time, because I think Shelter was set up shortly afterwards. Did you make it intending that to happen, or were you just throwing a spotlight on situations like that, or did you make it as a campaigning sort of issue?
Well, it was an extraordinary story. I mean, when I first we'd done a film called Up the Junction for the BBC, which was the first time we'd managed actually to do a film on the streets, written by a terrific writer called Nell Dunn. And her husband then was Jeremy Sanford, who was a journalist. And he'd written a play, and oddly enough, it was done at the Belgrade, called Dreaming Bandsman, I think it was called. And he'd done that. And anyway, I met Jeremy through Nell. Jeremy said, I've done this research, I've written this story about a family becoming homeless. So I read it, and the producer read it, Tony Garnett, we read it together. And we said, let's do this. We had to rewrite it again. We redid the research. In doing the research, we met the people who were going to start Shelter. And we met the people also, I think, involved in crisis. So it was one movement, really. And they would have set up Shelter regardless of the film. But it happened that they were at the same time. But the story was, of course the story is happening again now. and people are now losing their homes, and will lose their homes even more as the pandemic ends, and as the specific measures to support people during the pandemic ends, because I think they're going to end. They've had a no evictions rule running, because there's no eviction means you can't be evicted during the pandemic, but that has to come to an end if you haven't paid the rent. Well, many people got behind with the rent for obvious reasons, and it looked at the last I heard from some of the housing charities is that there will be a pile of evictions. And if you're on the streets with your family, well, I'm afraid the children have to be taken into care. You can't have children on the streets. So it still happens. But at the time, it did receive some publicity, and they did change one rule, which was that husbands weren't to be accommodated in emergency accommodation with their wives and children. But they did change that, so the husbands then would be given shelter. But of course the conditions are so desperate, and husbands will often go off to find work, and then when they go off to find work they don't come back, or things happen. And poverty destroys families. You know, I mean, it's not only like the immediate cause of homelessness, it's poverty. Because poverty, with the financial pressure, the emotional pressure, the stress, people can't deal with it, and families break up. And poverty is a great cause of that. So, but yeah, it was an extraordinary film to do, and we were privileged to be able to tell the story.
One final question. I think there's a gentleman, whichever, sorry, whoever.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, out of all your pieces of work, what are you personally most proud of? What do you personally think is your most important piece that you've done?
You can't say that. It's very difficult. I mean, because what you remember is not the finished piece. You remember the process. It's an old cliche, but they are like your children. And often the ones you feel most protective of are the ones that nobody remembers. So I don't know. I've been incredibly lucky. And the key thing I always have to say is we're a team, you know. And the one thing I learned with Eric Cantona, a great footballer, is that when we met him, everybody thought, wow, he's a big star. Not at all. He was a team player, you know. And I think making a film is very much about a team. And the writer is pivotal. So I've just been lucky, really. And hope we've rattled a few cages, you know. And I guess one thing you remember is that the old American trade unionist had a slogan was agitate, educate, organize. But we can agitate a bit. We can agitate a bit. We can educate not very much, and we can't organize at all. So it depends what happens when the people leave the cinema or the television, you know. But, anyway.
One final question. There's a gentleman down there, sorry.
You made a comment about the Labour Party. I'd like to ask you a question. I've been a member of it for 57 years, an active member. I'm now waiting for a letter to come from my letterbox expelling me from the party for being a socialist. Social media says that you were in the same position. Would you care to comment?
Unlike you, I'm waiting for the postman to drop a letter. I don't know. I mean, I think, what do we do about it? I think if you're in, stay in, but tell the truth. You know, you've got to keep telling the truth, and that's what they don't want. And when there are criticisms to make, you've got to make them, and they won't silence us. They might expel us, but they won't silence us. And this purge is a monstrosity. And it's a clear purge. And talking about the media, isn't it extraordinary? 120,000 people have left the Labour Party in silence. Imagine that had happened under Corbyn. What a storm it would have been. It's in financial crisis, ruined. If that happened under Corbyn, imagine the storm in the press. Not a word. So we've got to keep telling the truth, and I share with you, I'm waiting for the envelope, but keep telling the truth. What's going on?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for being in this fantastic auditorium here at Coventry Cathedral. Thank you very much indeed for being here for part of this, the Made in the Midlands podcast, and thank you very much indeed. Ken Loach, thank you.
Made in the Midlands is an original commission by the Coventry UK City of Culture 2021, proudly produced by Loftus Media.
Thanks for listening. Ta-da!